The scent of cheap cigarettes mingled with the musty dampness of the thick stone walls within the Supreme Court of the USSR in Moscow on a day in July 1941. The air here held none of the dignity of justice. It carried the stifling weight of a slaughterhouse. Outside, hundreds of miles to the west, the Nazi war machine was grinding through vast swathes of land, but inside this room, a different kind of violence was unfolding, cold, calculated, and systemic. Look at our subject, Dmitry Grigorievich Pavlov. Only weeks ago, he was a general of the army, commander of the Western Special Military District, the man holding the key to the Soviet Empire's western borders. Now he sat there, shoulders slumped, the vivid red medals on his chest, the fruits of years of combat from Spain to Mongolia, looking more like gaping wounds than symbols of glory. In this criminal psychological autopsy, we do not look for the obvious malice of a serial killer. In Pavlov, we are dissecting a far more complex psychological state, the paralysis of fear. Pavlov was not a traitor in the literal sense. He did not pass information to the Abwehr, nor did he intentionally open the borders to the Germans. But in Joseph Stalin's world, failure was not permitted to have objective causes. If the army collapsed, it was not due to the poor preparation of superiors, but because of the cowardice or betrayal of subordinates. Pavlov had been chosen to be the embodiment of that failure. Observe Pavlov's eyes as he listens to the indictment. They are the eyes of a man whose soul had been stripped away long before his rank was taken. How could a seasoned general who had commanded legendary tank battles allow an entire front to collapse in just a few days? The answer lies not in a lack of skill, but in the structure of the system he served. Pavlov's career was a series of promotions fueled by subservience. In Spain, he learned that adhering to Moscow's political doctrines was more important than tactical creativity on the battlefield. He had built a shell for himself as a loyal military expert, a true believer in the Red Army's invincibility. But that shell began to crack at 03:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941. As the first German shells rained down on Brest and Grodno, Pavlov had no realistic contingency plan. His western district, where the strongest forces were concentrated, suddenly became a massive monster, blind and crippled. Communication lines were severed, fuel depots were ablaze, and the tank divisions Pavlov once took pride in were encircled in deadly pockets at Minsk and Bialystok. The contrast here is horrifying. On one side, the absolute precision of blitzkrieg, on the other, the chaos of a command structure that dared not make a decision without orders from the top. Pavlov was trapped in a psychological paradox. He feared the Germans, but he feared Stalin even more. Every premise, every order to retreat and preserve his forces could be branded an act of treason, so he stood still. He issued unrealistic counterattack orders for units that had already disintegrated on paper. He waited for a miracle from Moscow, but received only threats instead. Now in the courtroom, that paralysis has transformed into a hollow resignation. Pavlov looked at the military judge's former friends, former colleagues, with a strange estrangement. He knew this script well. He had seen it play out during the Great Purge of 1937. The system needed a sacrificial lamb to appease the wrath of the man of steel in the Kremlin. Stalin could not be wrong, therefore Pavlov had to be. Pavlov's death was determined not just by the collapse of the Western Front, but by the necessity of an explanation for the people. How could one explain millions of retreating soldiers and thousands of abandoned tanks? The simplest way was to paint a portrait of a traitorous general, a man of panic and irresponsibility. The detail that strips bare Pavlov's entire psychology at this moment is his silence. He did not defend his tactical errors. He did not remind them that Moscow itself had ordered him not to act provocatively before the war broke out. That silence was not nobility, it was exhaustion. When a human being realizes that truth holds no value against the will of a tyrant, they stop speaking. The once mighty tank general was now merely a tumor that had to be excised to save the prestige of the machine. The death sentence was pronounced swiftly, without appeal, without mercy. A cold machine of justice had been activated, as precise and ruthless as the political games Pavlov had once participated in. So what truly went through Dmitry Pavlov's mind as he was led down to the basement of the Budyaka prison? Perhaps it was not hatred, but a horrific sense of relief. Finally, the fear that had lasted for years, the fear of a knock on the door at night, the fear of a displeased glance from Stalin, had come to an end. The gunshot that echoed in the confined space of the basement did more than end a man's life. It marked the completion of a purging ritual. Pavlov's body was tossed into an unmarked grave, his name erased from military records. But our autopsy does not end there. The real question is, why did this system need scapegoats like Pavlov to survive? And did Pavlov, in his final moments, realize that he was the architect of the very cage he was trapped in? We will travel back in time to find the answer, to the days when Pavlov was still Stalin's golden boy, when arrogance had masked the fatal cracks. To understand the collapse of a human being, we must strip them back to the moment they believed they were invincible. For Dmitry Pavlov, that moment was not in Moscow, but under the scorching sun of Guadalajara, Spain, in 1937. During the Spanish Civil War, Pavlov, under the pseudonym Pablito, was not just a military advisor, he was a rising star. There he commanded T-26 and BT-5 tanks against fascist forces. Amidst the roar of engines and the acrid smell of machine oil, a psychological nucleus formed within Pavlov, the arrogance of a closed system. Observe how Pavlov sent his reports to the Kremlin. A criminal psychologist would see there not objective military analysis, but a desperate effort to please the father of nations. Pavlov wrote of the superiority of Soviet armor, of how his tank divisions crushed infantry. He basked in local victories while ignoring a terrifying reality taking shape. Tanks were becoming vulnerable to new types of anti-tank weapons. Why would a seasoned soldier be so blind to reality? Because in Stalin's system, truth was not what you observed on the battlefield, but what the leadership wanted to hear. Pavlov understood that to survive and advance, he had to be the bearer of good news. He hypnotized himself into believing the Red Army was a perfect machine without flaws. In 1937, Pavlov returned to Moscow as a hero. He was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union and appointed head of the Tank and Armored Directorate. This is where we see the stark contrast between past and future. Pavlov sat in a luxurious office, surrounded by charts promising steel output and monthly tank production figures. He looked at the numbers and saw power, but forgot to look at the people who would have to operate those machines. A detail that says it all during this period was Pavlov's decision in 1939, disbanding the independent tank corps and parceling tanks out into infantry units. This was a catastrophic strategic error, running contrary to global trends, especially his potential rival, Heinz Guderian of Germany. What drove a tank expert to do that? Intellectual cowardice. Pavlov had witnessed the purge of talented generals like Tukhachevsky, a proponent of deep operations and concentrated armored units. To prove his loyalty and political safety, Pavlov denied what he once believed in to follow the will of Stalin, who was always suspicious of military units that were too independent and powerful. He began to believe his own illusions. Pavlov declared that tanks were merely infantry support tools and that any invasion from the west would be shattered right at the border by a lightning counterattack. Let us pose a rhetorical question here. Did Pavlov truly believe what he said, or was he merely repeating lines from a survival script he had already prepared? This arrogance reached its peak when Pavlov was appointed commander of the Western Special Military District in 1940. He held more tanks in his hands than the entire German army combined. On a military map, Pavlov was a steel giant. He organized massive maneuvers where Red Army units always emerged victorious in prearranged scenarios. But look deeper into the psychology of this commander. Behind the confident exterior, the portly belly, and the booming voice lay a latent fear. Pavlov did not dare request more spare parts, did not dare report the tank crew's lack of training hours, and certainly did not dare mention that the Germans were massing at the border on an unprecedented scale. The detail that unmasked the truth occurred just days before the war. As intelligence reports of a German attack began flooding in, Pavlov still spent time attending a theater performance in Minsk. He wanted to maintain an air of calm, wanting to prove to Moscow that he was in control of everything. That calm was not the confidence of a military genius, but the paralysis of a man who dared not face a reality that could destroy the worldview he had painstakingly constructed. He sat in the theater, listening to melodious tunes, while Guderian's panzers had already started their engines near the border. This contrast is bitter, a general enjoying art while the enemy's death machine prepared to slit the throat of his own army. Pavlov had built a castle of sand and coated it in steel-colored paint. He had convinced Stalin, and more importantly himself, that he was ready. But war is not a political report or a choreographed exercise. It is a surgery without anesthesia, and Pavlov was about to feel the first blade. As night fell on June 21, 1941, Stalin's golden boy was still sleeping in the glow of old achievements. He had no idea that in just a few hours, all those steel illusions would melt under the heat of Stuka bombs, leaving behind a naked, trembling human being, utterly helpless before destiny. How did a giant collapse so quickly? We will witness the moment truth shatters illusion at the dawn of the longest day. At 03:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the western skies of the Soviet Union were lit not by the dawn, but by the inferno of thousands of tons of explosives. This was not just the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. It was the moment when brutal reality began to tear through the veneer of lies that Dmitry Pavlov had painstakingly constructed. Imagine Pavlov in that moment. He had just returned from the theater, with the lingering scent of perfume and the echoes of artificial applause still clinging to him. When the first telephone rang, it was not merely a military notification, it was the death knell for his worldview. In a psychological autopsy, this is the breaking point. A man who once believed he controlled every number now realized he could not even control his own breath. What happens in the mind of a general when his entire communication system goes up in flames? Pavlov did not panic by screaming or fleeing. He panicked in a more terrifying way, biological freezing. Reports flooded in like knife thrusts. Brest is under shelling, Grodno airfield wiped out, German tanks have crossed the border. Pavlov's reaction. He sat in silence before his maps. The red arrows indicating counterattack directions that he had once drawn now looked like useless dried bloodstains. He was trapped between two realities, the one unfolding out there, where his soldiers were being burned alive, and the one inside his head, where Stalin was still waiting for a lightning victory. The detail that strips bare this paralysis is the way Pavlov processed information. Instead of ordering a tactical retreat to preserve his forces, a decision that required true courage, he ordered units that were already surrounded to counterattack immediately. Why? Because counterattack was the only word Moscow wanted to hear. In the mindset of a potential scapegoat, Pavlov understood that a retreat order, however militarily sound, would be branded an act of cowardice leading to the gallows. He chose to sacrifice the army to delay his own death. The contrast here reaches a horrific level. While the German panzer divisions moved with the precision of a surgical blade, severing Soviet corps at Pavlov's headquarters in Minsk, everything was a silent chaos. The red telephone rang incessantly. On the other end was the Kremlin. Stalin did not ask about casualties. Stalin did not ask about the actual situation. Stalin only ordered, destroy the enemy at the border, do not fall back. Look at Pavlov's trembling hands as he held the receiver. He knew he was lying. He reported that the situation is under control, that counterattacks are beginning, when in reality, he did not even know where his divisions were. Those divisions were now merely ghost divisions on a map, crushed by the Luftwaffe before they could even start their engines. A rhetorical question arises here. Is a general guilty when he cannot perform the impossible? History's answer is yes, if that general himself had built the impossibility. Pavlov had spent years asserting that the Red Army could defeat any enemy on their own territory. Now, with the enemy on his territory, he became a victim of his own lies. By the third day of the war, Pavlov's psychological collapse was complete. As the Germans surrounded Minsk, creating a massive pocket that trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, Pavlov was no longer a commander. He was a ghost pacing a smoke-filled room. He saw his staff officers commit suicide. He saw the despair on the faces of the signalmen. Yet he still did not dare face Stalin with the truth. There is a small detail that captures the total wretchedness of power in this system. When asked about the loss of contact with the 3rd and 10th Armies, Pavlov merely shrugged and said they were probably moving. In reality, they were being slaughtered. That shrug was not indifference. It was a refusal to acknowledge failure for fear of political consequences. In Pavlov's world, the brutal truth of the battlefield was not as terrifying as an indictment from the Politburo. He chose a conscious blindness. But the German war machine did not care about Pavlov's fear. The pincers closed, Minsk fell. Tens of thousands of tanks that Pavlov had once taken pride in became heaps of scrap metal by the roadside. And when the final reports of the total collapse of the Western Front reached Moscow, Stalin found the answer to his own failure. The name of that answer was Dmitry Pavlov. The red telephone finally stopped ringing with counterattack orders. In its place came another order, much shorter and colder: summon General Pavlov to Moscow immediately to report. In that moment, Pavlov knew. He looked at the map one last time, where the blue German arrows had pierced through the heart of the Western military district. He understood that he was not going to Moscow to report on the war. He was going there to complete his final role in a pre-written script, the role of the traitor. The transformation was complete, from an arrogant general believing in his own illusions to a commander frozen by fear and finally to a sacrificed pawn. Justice, or what the system called justice, was waiting for him in the dark basements of Lefortovo prison, where every lie would be stripped away until only one truth remained: Stalin is never wrong. We will now enter those interrogation rooms, where psychological autopsy is no longer a set of hypotheses, but a blade cutting into flesh and soul. The flight from the front back to Moscow did not carry the roar of combat engines, but rather the deathly silence of a flying coffin. On the crude transport plane, Dmitry Pavlov sat motionless. He did not look out the window to see his homeland being trampled. He stared into the void before him. This is the final transition in our autopsy, from a powerful god of war to a laboratory subject on the NKVD's operating table. When he stepped off the plane, there was no red carpet, no reporting salutes. Instead, there were the cold faces of security officers. In that moment, Pavlov felt a physical shift in the space around him. The light seemed to dim and the air grew thin. This was the psychological effect of being severed from the community. He was no longer Comrade General. He had become a nameless entity, a subject to be processed. Step into the interrogation room at Lefortovo prison. The light from a single bulb shone directly into Pavlov's face, casting deep, hollow shadows across his gaunt features. Behind the desk were the interrogators, the engineers of pain. They did not ask Pavlov why the armored divisions lacked fuel or why the radio communication network had collapsed. They asked him about treasonous conspiracies, about links to German intelligence, about systemic cowardice. Here we see clearly the decay of justice. The interrogation was not a process of seeking military truths to learn for the future. It was a process of constructing a political indictment with a predetermined outcome. The script had already been written at the Kremlin. Pavlov only had to sign it with his blood and his humiliation. The detail that says it all in this phase was Pavlov's hands. The fingers that once signed orders mobilizing thousands of tanks now trembled so violently they could not hold a pencil. The interrogator did not need to use excessive physical force on Pavlov. Psychological terror did the work for him. Pavlov was tortured by his own loyalty. He could not fathom why the system he worshipped, the system for which he had sacrificed his honor to protect with lies, was now turning to tear him apart so ruthlessly. Observe the contrast between the questions and the answers. "Why did you lose contact with the front?" the interrogator roared. "Because the Germans destroyed the entire infrastructure," Pavlov whispered in reply. "Lies, you intentionally cut communications to help the Germans encircle the Red Army." Military truth was distorted into political crime. In psychological autopsy, this is the process of dehumanization. To execute a hero general, you must first transform him into a demon in the eyes of the public. Pavlov was forced to admit that his failure was not due to poor capability, but to a treasonous will. And then the bitterest moment arrived, the ritual of stripping his rank. Imagine a barren room where Pavlov stood facing those who were once his subordinates or colleagues. An officer stepped forward, not a word was spoken. Rough fingers ripped the gold stars from Pavlov's shoulders. The sound of tearing fabric echoed like the snapping of bones. The medals, symbols of sweat and blood in Spain at Khalkhin Gol, were torn away, leaving behind frayed threads and gray voids on his chest. In military psychology, the uniform is not just clothing, it is an identity, a general's second skin. When stripped of it, Pavlov did not just lose his position, he lost his social existence. He stood there, naked in his tattered uniform, a soulless corpse among those who looked at him with eyes of loathing or fear. A rhetorical question here. At the moment those medals hit the floor, did Pavlov regret not choosing death on the battlefield instead of this ignominy? But the scapegoat script was not yet finished. Stalin needed a trial to set an example. Pavlov, along with his subordinates like Klimovskik and Grigoriev, was brought before the Supreme Military Court. The trial lasted only a few hours. There were no defense lawyers, no alibis. Pavlov sat there, listening to absurd allegations of a reactionary conspiracy in which he had never participated. The most terrifying aspect of Pavlov's psychology at this point was his acceptance. He no longer resisted. He answered questions mechanically, even self-incriminating in a desperate effort to end the pain. He understood that death was the only escape from this mental torture. The initial paralysis of fear had now metastasized into the paralysis of despair. The indictment read, "For cowardice, irresponsibility, and allowing the army to collapse, the defendant Dmitry Pavlov is sentenced to death by firing squad with the confiscation of all property." Upon hearing the sentence, Pavlov did not collapse, he only bowed his head slightly. Perhaps in that moment, the scapegoat general realized a truth more bitter than death. He was not killed by the Germans, but by the very shadow of the tyrant he had helped nourish. The system's justice had completed its logistical mission. A guilty party had been found, an explanation had been given to the people, and Stalin's prestige was protected behind Pavlov's corpse. The cold machine had selected its prey, and now it prepared to make the final cut in the darkness of the basement. We will follow Pavlov to his final breath, where the silence of death will confront the clamor of history. The night of July 22, 1941, a month since the first shots of Operation Barbarossa rang out, and also a month since Dmitry Pavlov's world began to disintegrate. In the dark corridors beneath the NKVD prison, time was no longer measured by the hands of a clock, but by the racing heartbeats of those about to be led to execution. Observe Pavlov's footsteps as he is led from his cell. No longer the polished boots of a general of the army, no longer the clinking spurs of a man holding power. He walked on bare feet or in old, laceless canvas shoes, a small detail designed to strip away the last bit of dignity and prevent any suicide attempt before the 0 hour. In this psychological autopsy, this is the residual stage, where individual identity has been completely crushed, leaving only a weak survival instinct waiting for the finality of the end. The execution room was unremarkable. It was not a dramatic stage with spotlights or eloquent proclamations. It was usually just a small room, lined with wood or rubber to dampen echoes and absorb blood, with a simple drainage system on the floor. The banality of this space is its most terrifying aspect. It turned the death of a general who commanded millions into a purely administrative procedure. A name crossed off a list, a bullet spent from the armory, and a corpse transported away in the dead of night. Why was Stalin's machine in such a hurry? Why not let Pavlov live longer to utilize his military knowledge as the Germans closed in on Moscow? Because in the mind of a tyrant, the existence of a living scapegoat is a threat. A living Pavlov was a reminder of systemic failures, of how Stalin himself had ignored intelligence warnings. But a dead Pavlov was a closed file. His death was the affirmation that failure is personal, not systemic. Look at the final moment when Pavlov was ordered to kneel or stand facing the wall. What went through that mind? Perhaps not images of his wife and children, nor his lost medals. Pavlov's psychological nucleus at this moment was likely a horrific sense of relief. The paralysis of fear that had haunted him for years, the fear of displeasing the leader, the fear of being purged, the fear of the truth, was now materialized by the black barrel of a Nagant revolver behind his head. The bullet pierced the medulla oblongata, ending Dmitry Pavlov's physical existence. A dry crack echoed in the basement, swallowed by the soundproof walls. Justice, the distorted and cold justice of an empire in panic, had been served. But our autopsy does not end with death. Following that shot was a process of historical erasure, damnatio memoriae. Pavlov's name was chiseled out of encyclopedias. His image was cropped out of photographs with the leadership. For the next 15 years, Pavlov officially did not exist. He was not a soldier killed in action, nor was he a prisoner of war. He was a void, a black smudge to be wiped clean. The bitterest contrast occurred in 1956, 3 years after Stalin's death. During Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization wave, Pavlov's file was reopened. A military commission declared Dmitry Pavlov was innocent of treason charges. He was not a coward, nor was he a German agent. He was merely a soldier placed in an unwinnable situation and turned into a sacrificial lamb. Pavlov's honor was restored. His family received his stripped medals. His name reappeared in history books as a victim of tyranny. But use the mindset of a psychological analyst to look at this rehabilitation. Is this true justice? Or is it merely another political ritual of a new system seeking to shed the responsibilities of the old? The restoration of Pavlov's honor cannot resurrect the soldiers who died in the Minsk pocket because of faulty orders, nor can it compensate for the spiritual collapse of a man shot in the back of the head by his own comrades. Justice here is merely a belated calculation on paper. A final rhetorical question for us: who is the real criminal in this script? Is it Pavlov, the man too cowardly to speak the truth? Or is it the system that turned the truth into a death sentence? Dmitry Pavlov's story is an autopsy of human fragility when standing before the pressure of absolute power. His core, the paralysis of fear, was not just his personal tragedy, but the tragedy of an entire generation of officers stripped of their right to independent thought. The dark history of World War II is not only written in heroic victories or overt genocides. It is also written in the blood of scapegoats, those crushed by the very machine they devotedly served. Justice, in Pavlov's case, was not a deity bringing fairness, but a cold logistical machine, always ready to sacrifice anyone to keep the wheels of power turning. Pavlov's remains may have dissolved into the earth beneath an anonymous cemetery on the outskirts of Moscow, but the psychological scar he left behind remains, an eternal warning about the price of blind obedience and the danger when fear becomes the sole operating principle of a nation. The psychological autopsy of the scapegoat general ends here, a life of steel, an illusion of steel, and an ending of lead, all sinking into the eternal silence of the Moscow basements.